For today's seminar, I am particularly excited because front and center today is a small critter that is near and dear to my heart, and that is bark beetles. With us today as a speaker, we have one of the foremost experts on bark beetles, and that is Barbara Bentz. Barbara is a research entomologist at the USDA Forest Service Rocky Mountains Research Station in Logan, Utah. And Barbara has been working and researching bark beetles since more than 30 years. And currently her work focuses on understanding the temperature responses and adaptations of bark beetles and what this will mean under climate change. The title of Barbara's talk is Recipes for Climate-Induced Bark Beetle-Caused Tree Mortality. And with that, I'm looking forward to a very, very exciting seminar. Barbara, the floor is all yours.
So, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to Rupert and the Tree Mortality Network group for inviting me to talk a little bit today about some of our recent research. As an entomologist, as Rupert said, my focus is going to be a little different from perhaps some of the past speakers and be a bit more about the insect predators rather than the trees. So a goal of the Tree Mortality Network is to provide a conduit for information about tree mortality and drivers of tree mortality that can then be used in management and policy making. So what I want to do is share some research on some evolved bark beetle physiological traits and how they will influence climate change effects on populations, highlighting the necessity of including this kind of information in our modeling efforts. So then at the end, I'd like to describe some unexpected tree mortality that we've recently observed in a high elevation pine in the western United States that's likely drought driven, similar to some episodes occurring in some lower elevation pines. So, sorry, I'm trying to get my little controls here all in trouble. So these trends in warming temperatures and decreasing precipitation that you see here are likely not new to most of you in the audience. Parts of the Western US and Central Europe are experiencing significant decreases in precipitation, and there's been numerous studies on both continents describing these increases in temperatures that are often caused by a combination of drought and bark beetles. So between about 2000 and 2010, mountain pine beetle was responsible for the majority of tree mortality in the Western US. Mountain pine beetle activity started declining at that point, and mortality to other species, including two other dendroctonous species, spruce beetle and western pine beetle, started increasing. So a large amount of the recent western pine beetle mortality occurred in California. These are showing here the USDA National Forests in California. And on the right, you can see that the tree mortality was most severe in the central part of the state this is the Sierra and the Sequoia National Forests. So a lot of great monitoring and research studies were undertaken during this time to describe both the environmental and the biological factors that influence this tree mortality. So you can see here the significant departure in precipitation on these forests during these time periods here shown in red. And this is an analysis of PDSI by Stevenson et al. In 2019. So this current drought was the most severe in the last century, and some reports suggest it was actually the worst in the last 1,000 years. So if you look at this middle graph here on the right from Keene et al., you can see how growing degree days, which is GDD, have been increasing steadily as PDSI is decreasing. So these trees have more temperature growing degree days, but they have much less water to help with that growth. So we can draw some general conclusions from a number of the studies that surveyed this tree mortality. First, bark beetles were the proximate cause of tree mortality during this drought, but the size and vigor of trees differed by tree taxa. So you can see here that in the Pinus species, the larger trees were the ones that were being attacked and killed. This was also found by Fedek et al., who also showed that Western pine beetle, Drodoctonus brevicomus, was the proximate cause of the Ponderosa pine mortality. Ponderosa pine in stands with greater basal area of Ponderosa pine, which is something that's often found, were also more likely to be attacked and killed. So Rachel Keene and her colleagues, however, found that the fastest growing large trees could also be the most resilient to both drought and beetles. And then highlighting the role of climate, Kuntz et al. Found that climatic water deficit was highly significant in predicting Ponderosa pine mortality. CWD is a measure of evaporative demand that exceeds available water. So it ranges from 0 when soils are fully saturated to positive values with no upper limit. And so the higher the CWD, the more plant stress. So these studies all point to the fact that drought stress was clearly a factor in this tree mortality, but that Western pine beetle's role was also important. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of research conducted on this insect, especially on its life cycle timing in multiple decades. So in a publication that came out about 60 years ago, in 1960, Miller and King synthesized some of the early studies on Western pine beetle. So shown here are summer emergence patterns on the Modoc National Forest, which is up here in Northern California during the early 1930s. This is a time period in the West that we called the Dust Bowl years. It was really hot and really dry. So you can see there's a lot of overlap in adult emergence, and this is just summer emergence, which was likely due to reemerged parents, but generally 2 to 3 generations were observed. So these are really the only published reports to date that I know of life cycle timing of this insect. Using other data, including some that was in the Miller and King synthesis, Robbins et al. Recently modeled the timing of Western pine beetle flight during these California drought years. And their results suggested a slight increase in the number of generations from historical times. And they attributed a 30% increase in Ponderosa pine mortality during this drought to this increase in beetle volcanism. Again, highlighting the important role of accounting for this insect-caused mortality. So we're also working on forecasting Western pine beetle generation timing, but just from a little bit different angle using some field data. So we initiated a study in 2017 to directly observe Western pine beetle generations. This is some monitoring that Danny Cluck with Forest Health Protection in California did. So basically we follow attacks and emergence on individual trees. So shown here are counts on multiple trees in a stand on the Lassen National Forest, which is also up here in Northern California. So the attacks are in green and the emergences in orange. And so you can see that between 2017 and 2019, and the individual trees are here, each row is a tree. So we saw one full summer generation each year with an overwintering generation where attacks on trees in early August resulted in emergence the following summer. So this was also repeated on the Stanislaus Forest, which is down here sort of in central, north of the Sierra National Forest. And we found similar results, although because it was a little bit warmer, these individuals in this winter generation, a few of them actually did come out before winter. So we're working on a model to forecast temperature-dependent generation timing using these data. But for this talk today, I wanted to highlight another tidbit of information in the Miller and Keene synthesis that applies to some other research that we've done. So they said apparently prepupal larvae have a considerable higher temperature requirement for transformation than do the other stages of this insect. The prepupal larvae is the last of the 4 instars before pupation. They suggested that a threshold between 10 and 15 C was required. And as you can see here, max temperatures at our Lassen National Forest site were well below this threshold both winters of our sampling. This catch-up scenario, as we oftentimes call it, is very similar to physiological traits in 2 other dendroctonous species that we've studied, whereby early instars with lower temperature development thresholds keep developing until they hit the prepupal stage, where they catch up and all individuals in the cohort become synced. It's kind of like cars stopping at a red light. So we found similar temperature thresholds and catch up in the mountain pine beetle and the spruce beetle, the 2 other dendroctonous species. So like western pine beetle, both species also have a prepupal stage here, which is the last part of the 4th instar and the stage just prior to transformation to the pupae, this guy, and it's also often an overwintering life stage. So again, temperatures greater than about 15 are required for this prepupae to pupate in both species. And this threshold is ecologically important because it protects this guy, the pupae, from going into winter, because this life stage is very cold intolerant. So basically, development to the adult stage can't occur over winter unless temperatures are greater than 15 C. And we believe this threshold limits both species from developing less than a single generation in a year. Jim Powell and I provided some other evidence for this thinking in this an American Naturalist 2014 paper, if you want to look at that. So this field data illustrates this physiological constraint for mountain pine beetle. So shown here are data similar to what I just showed for western pine beetle, where we tracked attacks and emergence of individual trees. And these data are from the San Bernardino forest, which is down here in Southern California. So there's 2 trees shown here, tree 2 and tree 5. So we found early attacks on tree 2 that occurred in June here, likely from reemerged parents. And these emerged in the fall here, resulting in the completion of a summer generation. However, brood from attacks in the fall, so these attacks, didn't emerge until July and August the next summer, putting the life cycle back to the typical for mountain pine beetle, which is midsummer to midsummer. Also similar to the western pine beetle example, despite relatively warm temperatures in the summers, temperatures over winter at this site rarely were above the 15-degree threshold for pupation, and therefore development did not occur across the winter. We observed something really similar to this at a low elevation site in southern Arizona as well. So a slight detour here. I just want to describe all the patterns of mountain pine beetle life cycle we observed in the field. The top row is the one we just talked about. This middle one is the typical univoltine attacks in the summer, emergence in the summer, attacks and emergence. And this was from a Ponderosa pine on the Tahoe forest, which is here in Central California. And then the bottom panel shows a semivoltine or a 2-year life cycle at high elevation in whitebark pine. In 2010, 64% of the brood emerged the first year from the 2009 attacks, and the remaining took 2 years. So you have some proportion of univoltine and some proportion of semivoltine. Yet the following year, only 14% of the brood emerged the first year, and the rest took 2 years. So if we look here at this picture of this site in May of 2010, which would have been here, there wasn't any snow at the site, which so meant it was really warm and you had a lot of univoltine brood emerge. The next year, over even a month later, there was a ton of snow still at the site, meaning it was pretty cold and you had not very many univoltine brood emerge. So what this highlights is how life cycle timing patterns from year to year are really dependent on that year-to-year variation in temperature. And also that in this insect volatinism tends to strictly be either most of the time univoltine or semi-voltine. Okay, so adding to that, we've done quite a bit of research with mountain pine beetle and spruce beetle. And our lab results that suggest that this threshold in the prepupal stage in both of these is actually a resting state or a diapause that is facultative, meaning it only occurs when conditions cue it. So diapause is a really common trait in insects, including many other bark beetles, including Ipsistographus. But in these species, cool temperatures induce these individuals into this diapause, again, to at least partly protect this cold intolerant pupae. So we also have development by temperature data for these species shown here in rates for mountain pine beetle and time for spruce beetle. And if we put those together on the same graph, we see that in addition to similar thresholds for facultative prepupal diapause, both of these species have similar development rates across temperature. So temperatures here on the x-axis, development rate, spruce beetle, Dendroctonus rufipennis, is in the green, and mountain pine beetle, and we have two populations of mountain pine beetle, are in the orange and the red. So point 3 addresses some recent research that suggests in addition to this prepupal diapause, both species also have some type of diapause in the teneral adult phase. That it's a reproductive diapause, and it helps to synchronize the life stages for that mass emergence timing that's so critical for successful tree attack. So it's important to note that we found variability and plasticity in these traits across the extensive distribution of both species. I'm not going to, I don't have time to really talk about today, but we did talk about some of that in this recent book chapter in a book that Kamal Gandhi and Rich Hofstetter recently published. So the point is, collectively, all these traits drive life cycle timing. So in spruce beetle, if the prepupal facultative diapause is averted by a warm summer temperature, the first winter is spent as an adult, and you get a 1-year life cycle. However, if cool temperatures induce this prepupal diapause, the first winter is spent as a prepupae, and because the adult must go through a cold temperature diapause to be reproductively capable, the second winter is spent as an adult, and thereby taking 2 full years for a life cycle. And as you might imagine, reduction in life cycle timing from a generation every 2 years to every 1 year can result in exponential population growth. So we don't have as much information on the diapauses in mountain pine beetle. We know there's a lot more plasticity, and varying life stages can overwinter, unlike in spruce beetle. But we feel like a similar scenario exists. And the upshot is that development rates, these thermal thresholds and diapause, regulate the life cycle timing of all 3 traits, and they're all thermally dependent. So what does that mean for the future and bark beetle population success? So it's likely that development rates and thresholds are not going to evolve in the short term. And theory suggests that populations that are in habitats that are cooler than their maximal development will move along the development rate curve. So if they're in this environment that's cooler and temperature is warm, they're going to move to more maximal development rate. and more time is going to be spent at these temperatures that result in faster development. Conversely, populations that are in habitats that are already close to their maximal development rate could be pushed into thermal regimes, these here where development rates go down, that result in slower development and potentially death as they move into temperatures that hot temperatures that cause death. So our lab studies for both of these insects suggest that the maximal life stage specific development rates for mountain pine beetle and spruce beetle is similar, occur in this range of about 18C to 25C, somewhere in here for the different life stages. So if we, shown here, are temperature data from the Cordix project for 2 global climate model scenarios using the worst case scenario, the RCP 8.5, and they've been masked by vegetation type, spruce and pine across North America. So the top row shows summer and winter mean temperatures in this historical period, 1981 to 2010. And you can see that during this historical period, the habitat of spruce in blue and pine in brown, orange, was mostly below this maximal development rate. So most mountain pine beetle and spruce beetle habitats were generally cooler than their maximal development rate. And warming is likely to accelerate development in summer. As you can see here, there's an increase in the area of the pine and spruce habitat that's in this range of maximal development. We're actually seeing this, effects of this warming taking place now. More spruce beetle are found developing on a univoltine life cycle, so they're switching from semivoltine to univoltine, and mountain pine beetle is becoming more successful at high elevations, also switching from a univoltine or semivoltine to a univoltine. So I showed you previously how summer temps drive the switch between uni and semivoltine proportions. So another thing that people talk a lot about is a reduction in generation times. So for these 2 species, for bivoltinism, which is 2 generations a year to occur, as I showed previously, these winter temps are going to need to be warm considerably and be above 15 degrees to avoid a delay in pupation. So although generally, here again is the winter temps in the future climate, although generally the temperatures do increase, the probability of temperatures exceeding 15C, which is here, in either of the spruce or pine is pretty low. So we suggest that the probability of bivoltinism in these 2 species will also remain low. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of geographic variability in all of these traits as the species have adapted to varying local climates. And so how these traits are affected by climate change will vary a lot across the habitats and latitudes. Finally, I've showed how evolved traits facilitate the stable voltinism strategies of univoltinism and semivoltinism in these species. But the Goldilocks phenomena, where warming needs to be just right, can occur. So in some locations, warming is likely to push populations into thermal regimes that these populations aren't adapted to. So fractional voltinism will disrupt their seasonality, resulting in population crashes. So shown here are forecasts from a mechanistic demographic model for mountain pine beetle that we've developed. And it's shown with the distribution of pines in North America, including ones that are outside the current range of the insect. So you can see here, the current range of mountain pine beetle is outlined in black, and all these pines are outside of the current range. But showing that at least some of them were susceptible, even though there's no mountain pine beetle there. So as climate warms through time, our forecasts suggest the probability of population success moves northward into British Columbia and Alberta, with range retraction occurring in the US as seasonality is disrupted. So the model forecasts that in the next 50 years, the area of highest population success is going to be in northern BC. And we're actually already witnessing this northward movement of mountain pine beetle. So now I'd like to switch gears a little bit and show some recent observations of an unusual and very unexpected bark beetle-caused mortality in an iconic high elevation pine species in the western US. So Great Basin bristlecone pine, Pinus longavia, is among the longest lived organisms worldwide. A single tree has been measured at more than 5,000 years old. It grows on isolated mountaintops across the Great Basin in Nevada. This is the distribution of locations where it's been confirmed in Nevada, Utah, California. And this is a picture here that I took out of a plane window when I was flying over this area, just to highlight these isolated mountain ranges in Nevada that have these trees on top, and then it's just desert in between. So this species has not been listed as a host to bark beetles in any of the common taxonomic keys. So we initiated a study a few years ago to survey stands and see if it might be a host to mountain pine beetle, which obviously would be the most devastating. So Great Basin bristlecone pine is often found mixed with Pinus flexilis, which is limber pine, and limber pine is a known host for mountain pine beetle. So we surveyed mixed stands of these two species. So we use three types of surveys, and you can see here by looking at these red columns, number of NPP killed trees. We found no Great Basin bristlecone pine killed, despite many limber pine that were attacked and killed by mountain pine beetle. A few Great Basin bristlecone pine had signs of mountain pine beetle attack here, but the parent and egg gallery was always aborted. We followed that up to see if mountain pine beetle was more likely to attack limber over Great Basin bristlecone pine. We adapted this box setup from those that Sigrid Nether used. So boxes were put on paired trees of each species, and 10 female mountain pine beetles were placed in each box. And after 5 days, we took off the box and looked at the number of beetles that entered each species. And mountain pine beetle was more likely to enter the limber pine than the Great Basin bristlecone pine. So then, to test what would happen if mountain pine beetle did attack Great Basin bristlecone pine, we manually infested male-female pairs into harvested bolts of both species in the lab and allowed offspring development to occur at constant temperatures. So in the end, as you can see here, more than 5,000 brood offspring adults emerged from limber pine, and only 54 emerged from Great Basin bristlecone pine, Pinus longavia. So this suggests that a majority of the offspring in Great Basin bristlecone pine died before becoming an adult. We also found that Great Basin bristlecone pine had up to 8 times the constitutive defenses relative to limber pine. So overall, these are results to this point led us to believe that Great Basin bristlecone pine likely has defensive traits that spare it from extensive bark beetle-caused mortality, despite being in the range of this native insect mountain pine beetle. Given that pines and mountain pine beetle are often considered an evolutionary arms race, these results suggested that Great Basin bristlecone pine may be at a point where it is winning this evolutionary arms race. But unfortunately, Great Basin bristlecone pine mortality was recently observed at 2 sites, Telescope Peak which is in the Panamint Range within Death Valley National Park in California. It's this point here. It's actually one of the southernmost range edge of 4 Great Basin bristlecone pine. And the second was in the Wawa Mountains here in western Utah. So the mortality at Telescope Peak is quite extensive, and it's occurring in mixed stands with limber pine. So in this picture, there's both Great Basin bristlecone and limber pine mortality. And then the mortality in the Wawa Mountains was way more isolated, and there was no limber pine there. So we visited both sites several times over the past several years to try and survey and evaluate what the causes of this unexpected mortality were. So when we first visited the Telescope Peak site, we found some Great Basin bristlecone pine that had recently been killed, and by peeling the bark, we confirmed they were attacked by mountain pine beetle. However, as we found in the lab study that I just showed you, many of the larvae in Great Basin bristlecone pine were dead. The dead trees at the Telescope site were also much bigger and older than those at the Wawa site, and included millennial aged trees over 1,600 years. So we sampled the tract trees of both Great Basin bristlecone and limber pine at this site to try and quantify mountain pine beetle attacks and brood survival. From the bark sampling that we found that mountain pine beetle adult brood emergence was minimal in Great Basin bristlecone pine. Here's adult brood emergence. You can see in bristlecone pine there was hardly any relative to limber pine, although the total sum length of the egg gallery was pretty similar in the two, suggesting similar attack density in the two species. However, there was no relationship between brood adult emergence and total egg gallery length for Great Basin bristlecone pine, again highlighting that the majority of brood died prior to emergence in this species. So these results support our lab results that Great Basin bristlecone pine appears to be a population sink for bark beetles. In the Wawas, we found not mountain pine beetle, but Ips confusus attacking the Great Basin bristlecone pine. Ips confusus is the pinyon Ips. It's usually found attacking pinyon pine, although its galleries at points look similar to mountain pine beetle. We were lucky to be there in the stand as trees were being attacked, and we found adult beetles, and they're very different morphologically from mountain pine beetle. So we hypothesized that the Ips attacking the Great Basin bristlecone pine at the upper elevations in the Wawas likely came from infested pinyon pine we observed at lower elevations, because similar to the mountain pine beetle brood production at Telescope Peak, brood production of pinyon Ips here was also really low. So at both sites, I'm only showing Telegraph Peak here, but the Wawas were similar. Climatic water deficit, which I mentioned earlier, is a measure of plant stress, and the higher the value, the more plant stress is going on. You can see CWD and mean annual temperature have been increasing, and then precipitation and actual evaporative transpiration have been decreasing, particularly in this last decade. You can see here with this regression line. So it's likely, so we estimated that the mortality at Telescope Peak started during about 2013, similar to that 2012, 2017 California drought period. And it's likely that these climate factors fueled mountain pine beetle population growth in the limber pine and stressed both limber and bristlecone pine, making them both more susceptible to attack. But I want to emphasize that the attacks on Great Basin bristlecone was likely spillover from brood emerging from limber, given that we found most of the brood in Great Basin bristlecone died prior to emerging. And then I mentioned, so Soaproot Saddle is on the Sierra Nevada forest. It's a site that is within where all the western pine beetle mortality was occurring that I talked about at the beginning. So here is the Sierra, so Soaproot Saddle is here, and Telescope Peak is over here. And so you can see that both areas have similar trends in this both climatic water deficit and temperature. So bark beetles and hotter drought likely contributed to this recent Bristlecone pine death. But again, because it's a population sink, the attacks likely came from other host pines, limber pine at the telescope site and pinyon pine at the Wawa site. So we're suggesting that in the future, Great Basin bristlecone pine will most likely be in areas where it mixes with these other pines that are host to native bark beetles. And also, unfortunately, where these hotter droughts are occurring. So I think it suggests that these hotter droughts are affecting bark beetles and their pine host trees across multiple elevations. So a few summary words. Bark beetles are definitely increasing the rate of tree mortality due to drought. I don't think it's, I think that's shown in Europe as well. Western US dendroctonous bark beetles have evolved multiple thermally driven physiological adaptations that allow them to be successful in a range of montane climates. Plasticity in these thermal adaptations is allowing success in recent years of warming, with these shifts from semi-voltine to univoltine, but success in future climates in some locations is definitely going to depend on populations adapting in place or migrating to climates that fit their evolved constraints. Again, something that's already happening as mountain pine beetles moving northward in British Columbia and Alberta. So to adequately forecast mortality of trees that are host to dendroctonous species, thermally dependent trait outcomes, like I've mentioned here today, really should be included in models. So of the dendroctonous species studied in the Western US, similarities in traits suggest that development of generalized models could be possible. And finally, our observations of bark beetle-caused mortality of Great Basin bristlecone pine suggest that climate change, particularly drought, these hotter droughts, may be disrupting evolved relationships between pine hosts and their insect predators. And with that, a couple of thanks, and then I'm happy to answer any questions.
So thank you very much for this great talk, Barbara. I myself am impressed by all that field work which must have been involved in data collection. So the question and answer chat is now open, and we will start with the first question by Harald Buchmann, who first of all thanks you for this great and highly insightful talk. He appreciates that the development towards bee volatilism has a threshold behavior because of the 15-degree requirement. However, given the sufficient warming, couldn't it be that the emergence of 2 generations is possible within one single growing season? So no matter what the winter temperature is?
Yeah, so basically like what I showed for Western pine beetle. We don't have development rate by temperature information for Western pine beetle, but my guess is that it looks different than that for mountain pine beetle. In other words, they will develop faster at temperatures that are a little bit lower than mountain pine beetle. So that the one place where we found the summer generation that I showed in that really warm site in Southern California, it wasn't warm enough. It was warm enough to have 1 generation, but not anywhere near warm enough to have 2 summer generations. So I think I mentioned that to get a generation over winter, it's going to have to warm what we call catastrophically, which it doesn't look like it will. And I think it'll have to equally warm a lot more in the summer as well. But then things could get all messed up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
good question.
So the next one is from Peter Biedermann. And he asked whether you think that bark beetles contributed to Bristlecone pine mortality, or did you also see mortality without bark beetle attacks? In the
Bristlecone pine, yes. we the slopes at Telescope Peak, I don't know if you could tell from that picture, they're really steep and there's a lot of scree, and it was difficult for us to sample trees very far off. There's a trail, it's a 7-mile trail to get to the top. And it's pretty difficult to get off that trail, but all the majority of trees that we sampled did have at least some sign of mountain pine beetle, although some had no sign, but they had wood borers in them and some other secondary beetles. What was interesting is a number of the trees that were cored to get the ages didn't show blue stain in the xylem. So one of our reasonings is that I think that blue stain oftentimes doesn't, the fungal hyphae don't get into the xylem until after the tree is actually dead. And so we think that even though larvae died in the Great Basin bristlecone pine, they must have done enough girdling to kill the tree, but maybe they weren't in there long enough to allow that much blue stain to develop and move into the xylem. So yes, there was some trees, but the majority of them, I think, of what we could sample did have some sort of sign of some sort of secondary bark beetle or mountain pine beetle. It's really sad.
The next question is from Andrea Battisti, who asked whether you could provide more information about reproductive general adults. Which are the factors?
In the diapause?
Mm-hmm.
It's been well studied in spruce beetle, and low temperatures induce it. Some recent work by Marianne Davenport showed that there actually is geographic variability in it. In other words, there's some individuals in the southern part of the range of spruce beetle. It's always been thought to be an obligate diapause, that they have to go through this, which is what keeps them on the strict univoltine or semi-voltine cycle. But she found that there were some individuals in the southern part of the spruce beetle range in southern Colorado that don't have to, they are reproductively viable without this diapause. So it's possible, that's where I was talking about the geographic variability. So it's possible that so it appears that there are the, I don't know if you want to call it the genes or whatever, but it is the possibility that if these individuals are continually in warmer and warmer climates, that they have the capacity to not have an obligate diapause. And we're just kind of figuring out the general adult diapause in mountain pine beetle. It's way more variable. And anybody that studied diapause knows how difficult it is to try and tease out what's going on. But we think it's also but it's also influenced by cooling temperatures.
So the next one is from Sigrid Neathera, who would like to know whether these Bristlecone pine stands are regenerating, so how well they are regenerating, and if there are mixed age stands.
I think the question was about regeneration. Regeneration, so these...
Now, how well they are regenerating?
Are they regenerating?
Mm-hmm.
At that particular spot or just in general? I'm assuming maybe just in general. Regeneration is pretty episodic in this species. It has to have, it's kind of the Goldilocks phenomenon again, it has to have everything to be just right for it to regenerate. The mortality at Telescope is very recent, and we haven't done the surveys to see what kind of regeneration might be occurring there, but that is definitely something that we're thinking about. A side note, these trees apparently don't senesce, and so they keep producing cones and for thousands of years.
Mirella Bellew asks, thank you very much for the great talk. What management measures do you think should be taken in near future to reduce beetle damage?
So the work that was done with Western pine beetle in California, I can't remember if I mentioned it or not, but tree density, and I think it's been shown in a lot of drought kinds of studies, that trees that are in higher density stands have greater probability of mortality. And so there is a push to reduce that competition in stands that are likely to be drought influenced. And then with Bristlecone pine, this is pretty new, and so we're thinking that if indeed these bristlecone are only going to be attacked if they're perpetually attacked if there's other host species nearby, that in really like where that 5,000-year-old tree is, you may need to go in and take out the limber pine that's growing around it to reduce the probability of mountain pine beetle being there to even attack it.
Yeah, Henrik Hartmann asked whether the beetles will be able to adapt to warmer temperatures also and develop bee volatilism, even if we don't think think now they'll do under future warming. So the question, sorry, will the beetles adapt to warmer temperatures also and develop bee volatilism, even if we don't think now they'll do under future warming?
So I think the question has to do with bivolcanism, right?
Yes,
but
maybe I just explain my own question.
Yeah, that's great.
So the idea was the beetle have a very fast sort of regeneration time. So actually the arms race you were talking about, can they outrun the trees by adapting faster to increasing temperature and then develop bivolcanism within sort of like a few years that would then lead to, to an even faster increase in population sizes?
Yeah, that's a good question. My comment about the arms race with Great Basin had to do with what I think the traits that Great Basin has developed to ward off this and kill this insect. It's probably terpenes is what we're thinking. But in terms of the beetle being able to adapt quite quickly, we tried to look at that by doing a translocation experiment where we took beetles from northern Utah and beetles from southern Arizona, and we put them at each of the two different locations, a true translocation experiment. And then we also put both of them at a much lower elevation in Arizona. And both populations still stayed on that, univoltine. The thresholds for diapause were still there. So even populations in this warmer location, they haven't adapted yet. So that was the only way we could think of to try and look at this adaptation. So the answer to your question is I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
We tried looking at it and didn't find it, but definitely, yeah, it'll be a good thing to try and look at.
I think we have time for few last questions. One is from Tom. Do you think we know enough that we can reliably predict these just right conditions for mountain pine beetle or spruce bark beetle? Or are we more in a situation where we know that fractional volatilism is liable to occur with warming, but hard to be sure what we might expect for a particular level of warming in any locality?
I think we do have the mechanistic model that Jim and I have developed, mostly Jim. I think that's the one I showed the results from. I think we can use it to play games with different scenarios to look at which ones will be just right.
Mm-hmm. Todd Ramsfield would like to know where the pine is.
But can I make a point there?
Sorry, sure.
So part of my hope to get across in this talk was that we really need more I mean, we've spent a lot of time, 25 years, developing this model for mountain pine beetle. It's a lot of field data, it's a lot of lab data, and it'd be great to be able to come up with funding to do that for like Western pine beetle, and increase what we've got with spruce beetle and other bark beetles. So,
yeah, really important point. Todd Rumsfeld would like to know whether Pinus flexilis also infected by Cronatium ribicola, white pine blister rust. Was there any relationship between beetle attack and the presence of the pathogen?
So in the surveys that we did that I showed, we also surveyed for white pine blister rust, and we never saw any on the trees that in any of our plots. And I'll note that it hasn't been found on Great Basin bristlecone pine in the field, although trials are going on, you know, at Dowena, looking at the resistance of Great Basin as well to this species, but we didn't see it in either of our species in our surveys.
Mm-hmm. Well, then a final question by Adriani. How damaging do you anticipate the migration of bark beetle northwards to be for forests in North America?
The northward movement?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of work going on in Canada looking at this by many people, Nadir, Alan Carroll, Maya Evenden, and they're finding a lot of interesting things, you know, like how jack pine maybe doesn't have the defenses as lodgepole pine. So yeah, I think it can be pretty devastating. The work that we did, I didn't show it. Oh, I guess I did show it because our mechanistic model also includes cold tolerance in it, and I didn't highlight it, but that central part in Alberta, out to the east of the current range of mountain pine beetle, it was not terribly suitable. So I don't know, and Alan Carroll, some of his work has also shown that maybe that potential for moving all the way across Canada due to many reasons may not occur right away, or it's less likely. But definitely going north, because lodgepole pine continues north up into the Yukon. So yeah.
So I think we're done with all the questions. Once more, thanks very much for this impressive talk and giving the great overview. I would shortly like to announce our next speaker in February, who is Anna Bastos from the Max Planck Institute for Biochemistry in Jena. She's the leader of the Climate Ecosystem Disturbance Interactions Group, and she will give a modeler's perspective on tree mortality. So please stay tuned for more information, which we will circulate in early February. So once more, thanks very much, Barbara, and the audience for listening. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, good to see you guys.
Ciao.